Toby Foster.
Toby Foster.
At breakfast.
BBC Radio Sheffield.
Thank you. In the news, Sheffield Council's looking to extend the existing injunction to stop people from taking direct action to prevent trees being cut down. Their current injunction expires on the 25th of next month. Now, 2 weeks ago, two protesters were handed 2-month suspended prison sentences for breaching that injunction. One case was thrown out by the High Court yesterday. Paul Brooke had maintained he was not in breach of the injunction because it was lawful for him to enter the safety zone to go to the defence of a female protester who was being forcibly removed by security staff. And that case was thrown out by a judge at the High Court. The tree felling programme's been on hold since March, and Mr Brooks says if the felling resumes, they will go back and protest.
If we're forced into it, we will be out there defending our city's assets. Our mature urban forest in this city needs protecting. Sadly, the people who should be protecting our urban forest is our elected representatives. They have failed since signing this contract to protect our heritage and our urban forest.
BBC Radio Sheffield.
Good morning, it's Toby at breakfast. It's BBC Radio Sheffield. Now, the Sheffield tree saga. I know a lot of people have had enough of listening to this. It's becoming more about trees. It's also going to become a lot more prevalent because there is a new instalment. First things first, yesterday, a High Court judge dismissed a case of contempt of court against Paul Brooke, one of the 4 Sheffield tree campaigners who were accused of breaching an injunction. 2 weeks ago, 2 tree campaigners, Dr. Simon Crump and Benoit Campan, were handed 2-month prison sentences, suspended for a year, for breaching the injunction. Paul, however, well, it was found that he didn't. He joins me now, fresh out of Shawshank. Good morning, Paul.
Morning, Toby.
Thanks very much indeed for coming in. First things first, you must be relieved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been very difficult for myself and my family over the last month.
When you knew you were going to court and when you knew what your defence was, how confident were you of getting off?
Very confident. For me, the issue was, and I still remain really surprised that the council decided to take the action. We informed them what my defence was, sent them the video evidence of that. Apparently, they decided that I shouldn't be allowed to use that defence in a civil case. So they took me to court on a technicality.
Wow, unbelievable. Basically, just to give a kind of praise here, and I read the judgment last night at about 11:30, so forgive me if I get it wrong. The judge, Justice Males, said that because you were under the impression that somebody was being assaulted within that safety barrier, which you weren't supposed to enter, then it was understandable that you entered. He does say that he thinks you were wrong in your assumption that she was being assaulted, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He says that he thinks I was wrong at that moment about whether the individual was being assaulted. He does actually agree with you that earlier on in the day, the infamous punch was a punch. And he also saw video earlier of the same protester being pulled away from the fence. He said essentially that I acted as any reasonable person would under the circumstances, and that was why he found in my favour.
There were 3 times, as far as I could see in his summing up, where he talked about what amounted to assaults from Amy-employed staff on protesters. Yes. Which is why he thought that you could be forgiven for thinking that the lady was being attacked. Tell us what effect this has had on you.
It's been very, very difficult for myself and my family kind of facing this, both from an issue that you kind of wake up every day with wondering what's going to happen. I think the other thing that's been extremely upsetting is the way that we were characterised on that following that day by South Yorkshire Police. I mean, Assistant Chief Constable Hartley came on and said there was criminality on behalf of the protesters and we were violent and aggressive and they had to change their tactics. Well, sorry, but their officers stood by and watched people being assaulted that day and then characterised us as the aggressors. That day did change things, and that was because of the violence we experienced, not the other way around. And that personally has been very difficult to live with for the past 6 months, being portrayed somehow as a violent and aggressive protester when actually we were trying to defend ourselves and defend our mature trees.
I did put it, actually, at the time to Assistant Chief Constable Hartley that that was an uppercut, without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah. David Hartley said that they'd looked at other evidence and it wasn't. Justice Mayles has now said, well, it was. Do you expect action to be taken against the uppercutty?
I doubt it. Sadly, the individual can't identify themselves because of the injunction, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. And it was 6 months ago. We want to move on. We don't want to go back to scenes like that. We actually want a solution, and we want really a clear plan about how we're going to preserve our mature urban forest in this city. We want to take a step forward, not keep going back.
Well, let's talk about how that happens. Lewis Dagnall replaced Brian Lodge on the Cabinet. Came in here before he started the job and told us what he was going to do. Been in subsequent to that and told us what he wants to do. He said he's going to be conciliatory. He says they're going to make concessions, or concessions will be made, actually. He couldn't tell us what, if anything, the council would do. As part of that conciliatory nature through the council now, they've applied to extend the injunction they have against tree protectors for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
Does that feel conciliatory?
Not at all. Well, apparently Lewis isn't in charge.
So he says.
I'm sure. I think you've got Lewis coming on later. I think he'll probably tell you that it's a decision for council officers and it's a decision for the legal team to decide what to do about the issue. So, who's actually running the city? Justice Mayles said this issue is one of local democracy, and it should be. If the elected council want to cut down every tree they can. Well, it doesn't appear that our elected politicians are actually running the city. It would sound like it's the officers and the legal team that are making the decisions.
Although Justice Mayles did stop the case and wait for confirmation that Julie Dore, the leader of the council, wanted this to happen.
Yeah, OK. And she came back and said she had totally agreed with it and she wanted it to take place. So presumably Lewis will come on and say that he's absolutely 100% behind having an extension to the injunction, and they want to come back and they expect to have more protests.
And that will be the case. Will there be more protests?
Of course there will be. Our council are the ones who should be looking after the city's assets. We're proud of this city. We're proud of the green heritage of this city, and we elected politicians as custodians. They're not their trees, they're our trees. We elected them as custodians, and they're the ones who should be protecting and preserving our heritage. And they failed to do that since they signed this contract. We think they're under the thumb of this contract, and they've failed to protect it. If they won't protect it, we will.
Lewis Dagnall will undoubtedly, I think, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, but has in the past said that this isn't down to him. This is council officers. This is council legal teams. The ex-leader of the council, Lord Scriven, has sat in that chair and said, actually, they could change it because they can change the policy.
Yep, of course they can. Yeah.
So why do you think they won't?
That's the stuff that we can't get to the bottom of. Lord Scriven also said it would be good if we had an opening and transparent inquiry to get to the bottom of what on earth's gone on. There are all sorts of theories range. You can go from one conspiracy theory to another conspiracy theory. Essentially, they signed a contract to fix the roads with specifications, and there's no appetite to change it. The council has dug itself in such a deep hole by saying this is for our benefit. There's nothing they can do about those trees. Every tree is assessed and all is a last resort. They have, in our view, told so many lies over the last few years. How can they possibly get out of it?
Well, that's interesting. Is this an extension on an injunction, or a new injunction they're going for?
They call it an extension on the injunction, but they're slightly changing the terms. They've extended some of the terms to include parks, to include walls instead of barriers.
But to include 17,500 trees, do you know?
It doesn't mention the figure of trees.
Because that was something crucial that Justice Mayles, when he gave the first injunction, he thought you were talking out the top of your head. When it came to the tree
and we
numbers.
were then proved to be right. There is a target for 17,500 trees. We can't understand why they need a 3-year injunction if there's only a couple of hundred disputed trees left, and it's all only going to be 6,000, and then a few dead and diseased trees over the next 20 years. We can only go by what's written down. Target of 17,500, that's still in the contract. We think that they still plan to fell a lot more healthy, mature trees in Sheffield.
How much is all this costing, all this court work?
It's
cost you anything?
It's cost us. It's cost each of us as defendants personally, and we've been fortunate to be supported by thousands of people in raising crowdfunding to help us. But it's costing the city of Sheffield, the people of Sheffield, over £800,000 for their farcical independent tree panel, which didn't make one decision that went against Amy. Not one out of the hundreds and hundreds of trees they assessed, not one tree did they make a decision against Amy. Paul Billington simply rubber-stamped every Amy decision, and it cost us more than £750,000. It's a waste of resources.
We will be speaking to Lewis Dagnall after 8:20 this morning. Paul Brooke, thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Toby.
Toby Foster
Toby Foster.
at breakfast.
BBC Radio Sheffield.
Very difficult.
Well, Lewis Dagnall is the Cabinet Member for Environment and Street Scene, I beg your pardon, at Sheffield City Council. He joins us now. Lewis, good morning.
Good morning, great to join you.
What do you make of the judge's decision?
Well, we always said that the council thought there was a case to bring, but the outcome was for the judge. It's the right outcome what the judge has decided.
So, how much has that cost us as a council?
Well, look, this entire matter is about the principle that people shouldn't go inside the safety barriers, and you can't put a price on health and safety of our frontline workers.
OK, in that case, the reason that the judge said that this was reasonable, what Paul Brooke did, is because it was reasonable for him to think that somebody was being assaulted because of what had happened earlier on in the day. An Amy security guard had punched somebody, somebody had been dragged off, had their trousers dragged at, and somebody had been kicked at. People who you're responsible for had done this. That's why it was reasonable for Paul to think it was going to happen again. What are you going to do about Amy and the people they employ now to get rid of those thugs? Are you going to change companies?
Well, I think the stuff that's being alleged should be looked into properly.
Well, it's not been alleged, is it? This is what the judge said in his judgment, the punch and the kick.
Well, I don't want to get into the individual cases, Van. That's something for our council officers to reflect on. It's something for Amy to reflect on. It must have been a very difficult time.
No. You're putting people on the streets who are punching protesters. That's been decided in the High Court. You can't absolve responsibility for this. Surely you've got to take responsibility for something as an elected officer. You're going to stop putting people on the streets, are you, who punch people?
Well, I think there's a proper process to follow in investigating that.
Well, the judge has judged. The judgment's there.
The judge has offered a judgment for the cases brought before him. I think if there's other stuff to be investigated,
so you're not stopping who you're employing. Those same people could be back on the streets.
Well, I think there's a wider point to be made here, and that needs to be remembered, which is we're currently paused. We're currently rethinking. We're currently trying to find a compromise from all sides that lets us move forward on a more amicable basis.
The compromise and the rethinking doesn't appear to have much imagination about it, because what you're actually doing is applying for 3 years of an injunction now. You're going for 3 years of an injunction, which I don't know how many trees you're planning on cutting down in 3 years if you're going to get the whole 17,500 done. But that doesn't look very conciliatory. It doesn't reek of compromise, does it?
Well, I mean, if you've been discussing this with the clairvoyant ants, you might have a greater insight than me. What I can tell you is that that isn't the plan. The plan is to find a compromise, find a way of moving forward. There's no target of 17,500.
There is.
It's done on an annual basis. And actually, if you want to talk about what the court has found, the High Court accepted the submission from the council that there isn't a target of 17,500. So this is done on a case-by-case basis with each tree. So we're going away and looking about where there's greater room for compromise before we move forward.
So if you're looking at compromise, if you're thinking about that, why are you now applying for an injunction?
So we're in a difficult position where the current injunction expires in July, and so the council has to make a decision now about whether it should be extended or lapsed. And that decision was made by the Director of Legal and Governance, but they consulted me and Julie, and what we said was quite clear. We want to get to a position where it's not necessary to have a High Court injunction to prevent people from dangerously entering health and safety barriers to prevent work from taking place.
And is that going to take you 3 years?
Well, I'm hoping we can make real progress. If everybody comes together and is willing to compromise, I hope we can make real progress this summer on resolving these issues around what is about 300 to 400 trees which are outstanding. The real prize is then if we can progress the discussion on to what we do for the next 20 years to look after the 37,000 trees that make up Sheffield's urban forest, and how we can harness the energy of community campaigners into looking after those trees, promoting them, looking if we can plant new trees.
But of course, if you do put this in place, and of course the protesters have said they will continue to protest, they have no interest in compromise because they're not seeing any compromise from the council. They say that they've compromised 3,000 times as these 3,000 trees have been cut down. Are you just going to continue your path of taking people to court? This isn't even a particularly successful injunction, is it? Nobody's been sent to prison. People have been found not to have broken it. It's costing us a fortune as a council. This is a really unsuccessful course of action. Why don't you just stop it? Is it because the council officers are telling you not to?
Well, I think there's 2 points here. The first is to remind listeners what the injunction is about. So people have a right to protest. That right to protest doesn't include dangerously entering health and safety barriers. When you've got workers up a tree, when you've got men and women up trees, it could be your brother or your sister or your son or your daughter, they've got a chainsaw, they've got the safety equipment, they've got a guy on the ground making sure they do this in the right way. If you go into the health and safety barrier, you're a danger to yourself, you're a danger to people around you, you're a danger to these workers. And it's just so important that there's health and safety of our frontline workers. But
so the judge ruled that Paul had gone in because earlier that day a woman had been punched and he thought it was happening again. That's why he went in. That's what the judge said. You're doing nothing to stop the health and safety implications there.
Well, like I say, things like that should be investigated in a proper way. The general point is the injunction is a clear deterrent to say to people, no, that, you're right, we welcome your right to protest. The right to protest stops there. But I want to say about when you say that you think campaigners aren't willing to compromise. As you know, I've been going around the city to meet campaigners and residents interested in the campaign, and I've now been out in most parts of the city where there's proposals in Dore, Totley, Crooks, Riverlyn, Mearsbrook, Never Edge, and I have been really overwhelmed by the willingness of campaigners after, what has been a very difficult few years, to put that to one side and to be willing to talk and be willing to look forwards to how we might find a compromise and work together.
But that's because you're saying that you will find a compromise, and so far there's been no notion of that. You've gone again for another injunction. You said in the last time that we spoke that really there's no room for the council to compromise. There's nothing you can do, is there, to affect that Amy contract? You've got no power. So there's no possibility of compromise.
Well, I'm really optimistic, and I'm really optimistic because Amy wants to compromise as well, and that's a very important part of this. But I think we can find a way. I think we can find a way of moving on. Well, I'm out there listening to. We've got this pause, which people feared would stop.
If you can't do anything, the only people who can move on this are Amy. What do you expect them to do, Lewis?
Well, Amy and council officers are currently working to reassess the proposals that have been brought forward, which were proposals about how to manage trees and bring the highways up to a very, very high standard. And they're going to look again now at what options are there, what trade-offs could you make, and what options that we can then in the summer present to residents. But I'm not setting a timeline on that because I want to bring that position forward when it's the best position we've got to have a conversation.
Do you think, then, this is crucial, do you think that when Amy comes forward with these proposals, they will say we're going to cut down X fewer trees?
I think we'll have proposals which residents will welcome and might find a way forward for compromise. But
okay, I'm going to ask you the question again. Do you think they will cut down fewer trees? That's the only compromise that anybody wants to see. Do you think they will cut down fewer trees?
Well, when they're reviewing tree replacement works, that will be one of the things they're reviewing, is whether these trees need to be replaced, whether they need to be replaced now. Can I say, there's 2 things where I think we have compromised. I think we've compromised because the pause is extending while we have these talks, and that's very welcomed by all sides. And there's a second point, which is when I've been going out meeting people, I've been listening to their concerns about how they want to see greater transparency. And so I can say today that I have instructed council officers to review again all the information pertaining to this programme and to tree replacement. And in the next few weeks, we will be releasing the maximum amount of information we can. And I've said to them very clearly, this is something I've heard on the street, it's something I've heard from residents, and it's something I want to put into practice.
Okay. And you asked them to review it. They will or they won't. So far, people seem to think that the elected officials aren't necessarily in charge of this, and you've got to, I suppose, convince them of something different. A pause is not a compromise. If you're on death row, you're on death row. If they're going to let you see Christmas, it doesn't really matter. You're still on death row. That is not a compromise. So far, they're saying that they've not seen any compromise from the council, and I can't see one either.
Well, it's been 6 weeks or so. This is a dispute which has been going on for 4 years. But actually, the root cause of this, when the council stopped maintaining the highways and the highways started crumbling, and was in the mid-90s, around the time when I was born, you don't resolve such a long-standing dispute within 6 weeks. So what we're doing now is...
What you hope you would do is get it right before you sign it.
We're starting the process by which we'll find a compromise from all sides and move forward.
Terry Fox, Brian Lodge, both thrown under the bus for this. When do you think you're going to go?
Well, I'm looking forward to being successful in bringing people together, finding a compromise and finding a way to move forward for the benefit of this city.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. That's Lewis Dagnall, who's the Cabinet Member for Environment and Street Scene at Sheffield City Council.